Hey, I thought I'd do a review of this article from Relevant Magazine called Why Do Churches Treat Singleness Like a Problem? I think lots of young people struggle with trying to figure out relationships and singleness and purpose and calling. And I also think that there's a key passage in the Bible in 1 Corinthians 7 that often gets used, but I think gets misunderstood in some significant ways, and then often gets applied or gets used to maybe justify some also perhaps unbiblical thinking in regards to calling and purpose. And so let's look at this article and go through it. Why do churches treat singleness like a problem? It starts off by saying, "Don't worry, you'll find the right man," she said to me for the third time, just before shoving me into the dreaded gaggle of single ladies waiting for the bouquet to be tossed. "Well, what if I don't?" I asked. What if I never meet the one? What if I never get married or have kids or settle down? Will you still value me? And I think this is something that people often ask, but I would maybe turn the tables a little bit on you and just say part of the reason that older people are pressing you on this issue is because they do value you and they do want you to find your purpose and they do want you to give you your calling. It may disagree with some of your feelings and opinions, but it's not because they don't value you. It's because they do, even if you may disagree with them. And that's okay. That's a good thing. Next, it says, "It's a question I have been faced with numerous times in my 30-some years. If I remain single, what will that do for my ministry, my growth, my friendship, and my relationship with the church? Sadly, no matter what I come with, all options seem to be saturated in placating words, pitying eyes, and aggressive attempts to set me up. But here's the thing. It's almost all arenas of life. I actually like being single. So let me talk about this too. Aggressive attempts to set me up. And I just want to say community is actually really important in this area. And community is important for every single person who ever enters into a marriage relationship. And oftentimes, like if you think of even like something much less important, like hiring somebody for a job, you actually knowing somebody who knows that person personally goes a lot further than just trying to get them to know them through the interview process, if you will, which you can compare dating to. And somebody can just put on a good show during the interview process, but you don't know the real them. If you know people who know the real them, that actually goes a long way. And even if you don't get introduced to your significant other that way, the community at large helps evaluate the intentions of this other person. They help safeguard you from maybe yourself a bit. And so community is actually really helpful in this area. And it may get annoying or frustrating at times, but overall it's a big win. It's part of God's design. And God's given you two people in particular, ideally, now, in a fallen world, this doesn't always work out like we want it to. But ideally, the way God's designed it is for every person to have two people in particular, a man and a woman, who are going to bring two different inputs into the situation, a mother and a father, that are incredibly biased to your best interest. And that's all actually a good thing, even if it's a little annoying at times. So they go on. "I actually like being single, save for the attempt to recover my comforter after washing the duvet, move a dresser, or play tennis. I've chosen it for now, at least." Of course, these aren't the highlights of, two is better than one when it comes to marriage, but I guess that's something. "I get to do what I want, when I want, how I want. I am not embarrassed. If I sleep until noon on a day off, I spend my money where I want. I can walk around my house in ratty clothes if I want, because I'm not trying to impress anyone. When I have popcorn or string cheese for dinner, nobody cares." Now, I'll be honest with you, once you get married, you can probably get away with that still good often. But here's the thing. Marriage does help you grow up, and it does help you mature. And to use maybe even a theological term, it does sanctify you. And that's actually a good thing. I actually talked with a young man recently, and I almost used this exact same argument. And I said to him, part of the purpose and calling of marriage is a woman in your life makes you grow up. And you're going to make much more responsible decisions that you wouldn't as a young man. It's amazing to me how many young men, once they get married, how much their diet changes. It's quite humorous, in fact, oftentimes. And it's amazing, you can't get away with doing silly things that you might have done in your single years, like eating ice cream for dinner. Even if you have roommates and things like that, and there's a community aspect in that regard, there's not the same kind of accountability. People aren't expecting you for dinner every night. People aren't checking on how you spend your finances. There's no direct implication when you have oneness with another person that directly impacts every dollar or penny that you spend. And so it does make you grow up, and that's all actually a good thing. This is actually maturity. This is actually a value and a benefit. What she's writing here as if freedom is some kind of ultimate virtue is actually not. When I look at this, I actually cringe a little bit. Someone should be perhaps maybe a little bit embarrassed, which I think they almost hint at in this itself, to write something like that. Freedom's not the ultimate virtue. And actually growing up and maturing is actually a good and noble thing. Can it be lonely at times? Sure, but it's also freeing. Please don't misunderstand me. I do wish to be unsingle one day. I do want to have children, and I am not opposed to dating. I am not rejecting all potential relationships. I love the concept of marriage. I really do. In other words, she's still on the market. Young men who are part of her church, take note. Marriage is a beautiful picture of Christ's love. It absolutely is a gift. I am thrilled when people I love get engaged. I've obviously never been to a wedding where I didn't cry. I have incredible examples of marriage sprinkled all over my life. I'm a sucker for a good romantic comedy. Because marriage is not God's only gift. It is not the central focus of my life's trajectory either. Though, to my disappointment, it feels like finding the one becomes my top priority. I may never fully fit into my mold many within the church long for me to embody. And she's going to say down here at the age of 29, well, here's the thing. The older you get, the more the sense of urgency, I think, that the community around you rightfully has for your own sake to find that person. Because there is a timetable on some of the stuff that you want to accomplish in a married situation. And there's just the goodness and the health and the sake of it. It's very natural for these things to take place. And so it's okay for other people around you to sense that urgency and to help with that. That's actually a very loving thing. For a community to see people, getting older and older, and to show no concern for them not getting married, actually be unloving, I think. And so, the Lord always has to remain the top priority in that sense, but I'll talk about this at the end, but there's some things you can do that would be in perfect harmony with the Lord being your top priority, and it's very seriously taking the callings that God has on your life. So she says this, at the age of 29, I was turned away by many couples-only small groups, told by the attendants, some of my closest friends, that we were no longer in the same stage of life, and placed in a group with recent college graduates. And, I don't know, it sounds like there's a story behind the story there. I mean, if she as a single person was trying to get into a couples-only small group, if I was single, I wouldn't be signing up for a couples-only small group, but, I don't know what's going on there. I was implored to get further involved with the church I was attending, and after choosing the prayer group, was told it was off limits, as praying with a married man could cause him to stumble. And so anyways, you shouldn't be praying one-on-one with a married man. I feel like you should just know that anyway, and a married man shouldn't be praying one-on-one with a single lady. That is just common sense. There's nothing wrong with that. There's boundaries before you get married to keep two single people apart. And when you get married, there's boundaries to keep you and that person you're in covenant with together, and that's good and that's right. But being in a prayer group, I can imagine plenty of group settings where it'd just be very normal for people to get together and pray. So again, I feel like we're missing a lot of details here, but either way, I sympathize with some of this, and maybe there's some confusion here going on at the church. I don't know. I've been told that I will not truly know what it means to love until I'm married with children. And you know what? God will grow you in how you love. I remember when we had our first child, God did something to me. It's wild when becoming a dad, God literally does something to you. And then when you have your second child, when you have your first child, you think that how could I, love another child like I love this child? And then you have that other child and you love them too. God definitely uses all kinds of things in our life, not just marriage and family, but he does use those things to grow us and to teach us, and it's a wonderful thing. Recently, a friend confessed, I guess I'm saying the glass is half full, not half empty. Recently, a friend confessed that many years she was dying for a life partner because her pastor told her that this was the only way to heal previous wounds. She eventually got married, and within only a few years, she was divorced. The church disillusioned me. She told me life didn't get better. Instead, it was my same broken self. And while I should have gone to counseling, I turned my husband to fix me, to heal me. That was a huge mistake. And absolutely, that does sound like a huge mistake. And so, yeah, marriage is definitely not a be-all, end-all. And it takes, all this, you bring a lot in. You bring two broken people into a marriage. That's every marriage. And so in both of you, need to be committed to always working on your marriage and continuing to grow in faith in the Lord. And so that's really a question on who you marry. That's not a problem with marriage itself, but it is a problem with setting false expectations for what marriage is. And so, again, some good, healthy, normal premarital counseling. Even in the secular world, purpose of premarital counseling is to shatter expectations. So if you're in premarital and your expectations aren't being shattered, they're doing it wrong. If nothing else, that's one of the goals, and to teach people that they always need to be working on their marriage. While much of the New Testament speaks of multiplying the church through community, missions, and outreach, and even implores people to stay single, it seems like we have a greater focus on growing faith through marriage and procreation. So there are two aspects of this. One, realize that when the New Testament church was forming, it was going out into unreached areas. And we don't have a whole lot of stories of the next generation in the New Testament of the church being formed where they are having children. There's no doubt that would just naturally become a focus. And there's nothing wrong with that. And we still to this day see how important it is to do ministry to young people and for them to put faith in Jesus Christ. You don't want to take any of that for granted. So doing ministry to within your own ranks, if you will, is really important for the future of those children. It's just the loving thing to do. Nevertheless, I've never met a church or known anybody who literally birth is the chief strategy of missions per se. I do think people having children and family is just a normal mission of humanity, and the church, who prizes the way God has made things, sees that as important also. But those definitely aren't competing things, and ultimately would fall into the mission of procreation, would fall into the mission of the Great Commission, no doubt. So I see that as all a positive that works together, provided that we're not replacing one with the other. Think about it like this. If you were to get married, she says, around 25, this is my favorite sentence in the whole article, and they still haven't changed this. And I don't think I'm reading it wrong. You tell me in the comments. If you were to get married around 25, be married for about 40 years, lose your spouse at 75 or so, and live to be 90 years old, you'd still live almost half your life single. So get married at 25, be married for around 40 years. So 40 plus 25 is 65. Lose your spouse at 75. There's a 10-year gap here. So I'm guessing this is supposed to be 50. 50 plus 25 is 75. Yeah. And so live to be 90. So anyways, you'd be married 50 years. That's 50 of 90. That's over 50% of it. So I think her math is wrong. And either way, if you look at it this way, you'd spend 15 years as a widow, and you'd spend 5 of your adult years as or 7 maybe of your adult years as a single unmarried person. And so those are completely two different stages of life, and that's okay. But anyways, that's a significant amount of time. And we as a church need to recognize that although being married is a beautiful thing, so is being single. Neither position trumps the other in matters of value or authority. We are blessed to have diversity of experiences among us. And then we get to the key passage here, and this is really what I want to talk to you about today. And so she quotes 1 Corinthians 7:7-8. So I want to go there with you now. Let's see here. So it says, yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. And I learned this first from Denny Burke or Thomas Schreiner. I'm not sure who off the top of my head anymore. But the word here, unmarried, they didn't have a word for a male widow. Okay, so Paul uses the word here, unmarried, but it's basically a technical designation almost in this passage to refer to a man who had a wife, she's passed on, and he's unmarried. All right, and then you did have the word for widow, and so this would be a female whose husband has passed on. And so when he's saying that they remain even as I, he is literally talking to that group of people, to people who are widows and or the unmarried in using this phrase. And so it's not talking about single people who's never been married. And so just point blank, this verse is being used out of context here. And it's not until verse 25 that they actually say, and speak to singles who are virgins, those who've never been married, now concerning virgins. And so he's switching topics. And he goes, I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who is led by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. And so what you need to realize here is Paul shares the commands of the Lord that he gave while he was on earth. All right. But now, as he's talking to people who have never been married, he's actually softening his preferences here. Okay. But in verse 26, we're given the first reason for why he is giving these preferences in 1 Corinthians 7. And he says, I think then that it is good in view of the present distress, he says, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. And so, in other words, he's saying there are external circumstances, and there's lots of questions on to what that present distress is. Could it be famine? Could it be war? Could it be persecution? We don't know, but almost the commentators that you'll read on this agree that it was some kind of current distress, something that was causing some kind of real present hardship for them. And he's saying because of that, it will be more difficult to be married in this time. And this is an idea that is true throughout Scripture. Jesus talks about it, right? Different stages of life that'll be more difficult in the tribulation. Woe to those who are with child, he says. In Deuteronomy 24:5 in the law, it was actually when a man was newly married, he couldn't be shipped off to war. He had to make his wife happy for a year, it says. He shall give happiness to his wife. There's a good verse, men. He shall give happiness to his wife. And so there was just something right about that. We do that in our day and age. If we have a young couple and the man's about to ship off to war and they want to get married before he does, we'd probably say, well, wait till he comes back. Like, you don't need to get married, a week before he ships off. That just doesn't make sense. We're introducing unnecessary hardship. And so it seems like Paul is just doing the same idea. In other words, this isn't some like new teaching in the church that singleness for the sake of the gospel is better than marriedness for the gospel. It's not. I think that's what this passage often gets over spiritualized into. I think he's down to earth, being really practical and saying because of the present distress, it'd be really hard to be married right now or to get married right now. And so, I think I have good evidence to show why that is, and it's this. If you go to 1 Timothy 5:11, and 1 Timothy is written to the church that's in Ephesus, it's an authorization letter that's given to Timothy. And so this letter probably would have been read to the congregations in Ephesus. And he says, he gives the command here, but refuse to put younger widows on the list. For when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, and they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. In other words, they were taking widows who were 60 plus age, who didn't have any family ties who could take care of them, and they're enrolling them into some people think some kind of prayer ministry it's in the church, but they're taking some kind of pledge with this to be committed to it. He says, don't put younger widows on it. He goes, they just need to get married again, is what he's going to say. And so they need to raise more children. They need to do their duties of being a godly woman and a godly wife, is what he goes on to argue in this passage. And so Paul commands that. And this, again, is authorization, that letter that would have been broadly distributed in Ephesus through Timothy's work there as a church planner. And so because you have this forceful command here in 1 Timothy 5, and you have this preference because of present distress, I think you see what's going on here. I think it's down-to-earth advice in 1 Corinthians 7, and I think it's very similar, but a command in 1 Timothy 5. And so, in other words, the Bible understands that God has made things a certain way, and it is the normal practice for most people, all right, to get married, to be fruitful, and to multiply. That is God's normal pattern and calling on most people. It's not like a 50-50. Where it's like half the people are called to marriage and half the people are called to singleness. And what I often think happens, and I honestly think that the person who writes this article is doing, because of all their reflections on how much they enjoy singleness, they think it's their choice. It's their calling. And the truth of the matter is, a calling is supposed to come from the Lord. It's supposed to be top down. And we're supposed to surrender to it and fulfill it. Just like Adam and Eve are to fulfill their callings. Or we as Christians are to fulfill our callings, like the Great Commission. And so I think we need to rethink how we think of calling. Calling is something that comes from the Lord, not something that's born from my internal desires. I do think, though, there's an aspect of gifting here, because Paul does talk about that in 1 Corinthians 7. And so, but the gifting is obvious. The fact that, like, for example, this young lady wants to get married hints to me strongly she has the gifting towards marriage. And so if she has that gifting, then she has a pretty good idea of then what is the calling. And then she needs to open up her hands to the Lord and say, Lord, have your way. I'm open to this calling, despite the fact that it's going to get rid of all these nice freedoms I might enjoy as a single person. Because God, that's your path for me. That's the way forward for me. Now, what you don't want to do, the big mistake you don't want to make, is you don't want to marry the wrong person. Okay, that is worse. If you marry an unbeliever, if you marry somebody, who's not who they say they are, and so on and so forth, that's a huge mistake. So rushing into marriage for the sake of marriage is wrong. But finding the person that you're supposed to marry can be a top priority in life. It can't be above Christ, okay? But it can be a priority. And the way that a Christian then, the way that a young lady in particular, part of the way she opens her hands to the Lord is she begins to talk to her Lord about it. She says, Lord, you are my Lord and my God, and provide for me a man to marry, a godly man that I can honor you in the callings, in the giftings that you've given me. And if she just begins to diligently pray about that, I really believe that it is one of a great spiritual exercise that is perfectly consistent with keeping Jesus as your top priority and fulfilling these other callings that God's called you to in your life. And that's something simple that every single believer in that stage can do. And even though it can get frustrating with other people pestering you about it, and you constantly thinking there's a lot of eyes on you in regards to this issue, I think it's the right thing to do. And I'd hate for you to miss out on what the Lord has for you simply because of preference, opinion, and feeling. And so as a young man, I'd say something even stronger. I'd say he who finds a wife finds a good thing and receives favor from the Lord. So I feel like you have a little bit more onus on you, and it's go find a godly wife. Pursue it. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. You must leave and cleave. Okay, that's true of both of you, but you are the pursuer as the male in the relationship. So go pursue. And I think that's a godly thing to do. Again, rushing into a marriage with the wrong person is dangerous. All right, we see marrying non-believers in the Old Testament. I think that's what you have going on in Genesis 6 with the righteous line of Seth, marrying non-believers with the wicked line of Cain and Lamech. And I think it's what happens with the Solomon's heart being taken away from the Lord and the division of the kingdoms and so on and so forth. Marrying a non-believer throughout the Bible is seen as a very dangerous thing. But as far as that calling of marriage and doing it the right way and finding the right person by the grace of God, that is still an important thing to be pursued in some ways. And if nothing else, to be pursued in prayer. And for men, you in particular must pursue even more and find that godly wife. If you disagree with me, let me know why in the comments. I'm happy to talk about this more. This is a subject I'm passionate about, but I oftentimes think that as Americans, we certainly have tremendous personal preference. But as a believer in the Lord, if you really believe there's callings of God in your life, you need to figure out what those are, and you need to walk in them. All right? Thanks for listening.